My name is Evan, 28 now. The story starts when I was 21. I grew up in a middle-class house that looked fine from the outside but felt cold inside. My mother favored my brother Leo. In her eyes, he could do no wrong. I was the quiet, bookish kid, stacking part-time shifts and saving because I knew help wouldn't come. Leo was the opposite, effortlessly charming, winning over teachers, coaches, and parents. Then I met Maya. We'd been together over a year, sketching plans to move in after graduation and talking about work. She said she admired my drive. I balanced 2 jobs with classes, trying to build a life on my own terms. With Maya, I felt seen. But Leo carried a low flame of competition. The spotlight was never bright enough. He liked steering any room his way. At family dinners, I kept fading into the background beneath the praise thrown his direction. Each compliment for Leo felt like a small subtraction from me. Looking back, the lines were already drawn, not between success and failure, but between applause and quiet effort. Nothing had erupted yet. The air simply shifted the way a distant storm begins. I didn't know the person who made me feel visible would soon become a measure of my worth, and my family would let it happen. Maya and I had been together long enough for our sketches of later to take shape. She said she valued my grit classes, 2 jobs saving, so I wouldn't owe anyone. I thought that would be enough. Leo didn't. He opened with jokes that sounded friendly but aimed to bruise Evan's always working. Dating his schedule must be exhausting. At a family dinner, he retold a high school gas money story, conveniently trimming the part where I paid it back the next day. Laughter rolled around the table. Maya kept quiet, but her eyes stepped back. One evening, Leo hosted a low-key hangout. I arrived only to discover I was the program. He narrated, voice like a champion, Evan's diligent, sure. But some people were made to enjoy life, others to keep juggling. His friends chimed in. I defended myself, and every sentence was spun as proof of my insecurity. Maya sat beside me, listening to a tune she once loved that suddenly felt out of key. A few weeks later, Maya said she needed to be honest. She couldn't picture a future with me. She wanted presence, and all I had to give was work. I nodded. I didn't blame her. I just didn't expect to see her by Leo's side almost immediately after. I went home hoping my mother would at least ask if I was okay. She smiled like it had been inevitable. The girl knows what she's doing. Then the line that lodged in my throat. A bright woman chooses the man with prospects. My father turned a page of the newspaper. No comment. In that room, my heartbreak had no market price. That night, I packed a bag, blocked numbers, left the family chat. No vows of revenge, only a clean decision. If I was a shadow to them, I would leave their lights entirely. I rented a small room, set a notebook on the desk, and wrote one sentence. Freedom begins when you stop asking others for permission to exist. Then I locked the past behind me. I moved into a narrow room that had the personality of a storage locker and the rent of an optimist. A mattress on a plywood frame. A folding desk with a wobble I learned to forgive. A plastic bookshelf bowing under the weight of the textbooks I told myself were investments rather than ballast. I closed the door on that first night, slid the deadbolt with a click that sounded like a decision, and opened a fresh notebook. On the first page, I wrote a sentence I wanted to be true, even if I didn't fully believe it yet. Freedom begins when you stop asking for permission to exist. I underlined it twice, tore the SIM out of my old phone, put a new number into a new handset, and left the family group chat without a dramatic farewell. No vows of revenge, no late-night speeches to the mirror. Just subtraction. Remove what drags, then see what remains. Morning arrived without ceremony. I woke at 5:30 to the sound of the bus exhaling at the corner and to the surprise of my own resolve. I ran an awkward shuffle that remembered high school PE more than any adult notion of fitness, and came back with a stitch in my side and a clear head. Coffee in a chipped mug, 2 boiled eggs, and a spreadsheet I called a budget, even though it was closer to a confession. I gave each dollar a task. Rent, food, transit, books. There was a column named What If That I filled with numbers I hoped to never use, and a column named Later that I touched like a superstition. I wrote emergency fund at the top and split the word with a hyphen, as if breaking it in 2 would make it less of a mountain. At work, I volunteered for what the veterans avoided: the dusty ticket queue, the data nobody trusted, the weekend report everyone resented because it always revealed something inconvenient on Monday. I learned that usefulness hides in the unflattering corners. If you show up where boredom and irritation overlap, you'll often find the lever that moves the room. I was not brilliant, not gifted, not that person who floats through tasks with the air of a prodigy. I was, however, available. I was consistent. I was there early enough to see what was slipping and late enough to sweep it back into place. I divided my evenings into 50-minute blocks, with 10-minute breathers like a factory that made competence. The wall above my desk gained a paper calendar that recorded X's instead of memories. The hallway gained a neighbor who asked once, peering into my room as if sidelong, "Are you studying for something or running away from something?" The answer was yes, to both. Most nights I fell asleep to the soundtrack of buses in the apartment upstairs, practicing trumpet in the key of regret. The first small win didn't look like one. I inherited a spreadsheet bloated with manual entries and formulas that contradicted one another the way rumors do. People had been tiptoeing around it, afraid that touching one cell might collapse the rest. I rebuilt it from scratch, documented each sheet with a paragraph in simple English, and attached a one-page note titled, "What this tells us, and what it doesn't." No fireworks, just clarity. When my lead saw it, he tapped my shoulder and said, "Nice work." It was 2 syllables of oxygen. I printed the email and tucked it into the notebook behind the sentence about freedom, as if one were proof of the other. Momentum, when it arrived, did not roar. It clicked. A small automation script that shaved 3 hours off a Thursday routine. A template for weekly updates that answered the questions our manager always asked, so no one had to brace for them. A checklist we ran before deadlines that reduced last-minute panic to a manageable hum. We didn't become brilliant. We became less chaotic. I learned that in most rooms, that's what competence really looks like. There were mouthfuls of humiliation, too. A demo where I misread the numbers and built confidence on sand in front of 3 directors. A day when I merged the wrong branch and spent the afternoon restoring the world to what it had been at 9 a.m., which is a special kind of shame. A week when an exam I'd studied for at 1 a.m. betrayed the fact that I'd memorized the edges but not the center. I failed it by 3 points. I went outside, sat on a bench on the wide concrete shoulder of a downtown plaza, and watched the city move without me. Failure turned out not to be a verdict, but a mirror. It reflected where I was fragile, not where I was doomed. I booked the retake, wrote "Understand, don't recite" at the top of the next page, and rewired the way I studied. 2 months later, I passed in a room that smelled like dry carpet and determination. My bank account stabilized enough to stop looking like a cliff. I filled an emergency fund, first 1 month of expenses, then 3, then 6, counting not just money but nights of sleep I had purchased in advance. I learned that the point of savings is not to hoard. It is to edit what you are forced to say yes to. I read about investing like a person learning a language he planned to speak politely rather than fluently. I chose boring. A small automatic contribution to broad funds that I understood sufficiently to leave alone. I wrote myself an investment policy statement in the notebook: never invest in something you don't understand. Don't chase returns. Don't time the market. When in doubt, increase your savings rate and your skill set. It was less a strategy than a set of guardrails. Boring, I discovered, is brave when your past is chaotic. I sold the old car that had become more identity than utility and learned the habits of the bus. There's an intimacy to public transit that endures beyond novelty. The same faces at 6:10 each, at a different chapter of their private story. The nurse with a lunchbox decorated by a child's stickers. The man who read short paperbacks and smiled at the acknowledgments page. The pair of teenagers who traded earbuds and conspiracies. I liked that my ambition shared a vehicle with their mourning. I liked that my plan, such as it was, had to fit in a backpack. In the office, I collected people who were better than me at something and asked them questions like a polite thief. Jonah could debug by listening to a system the way a mechanic listens to an engine. Lila translated executive vagueness into annotated tasks no one could misunderstand. Maria took chaos personally, a project manager who believed meetings should be short enough to hold in one hand. I asked each of them the same question in different ways. What do you wish you knew when you started? Jonah said, logs or diaries. Learn to read their handwriting. Lila said, if a task has no owner, you own it until someone else does. Maria said, make every meeting produce an artifact, an agenda beforehand, a decision, or a note afterward. If there's no artifact, there was no meeting. I wrote these down and pretended I had discovered them when it was time to teach someone newer than me. Teaching found me before I felt ready to go looking for it. A manager asked if I'd run a brown bag on the way we approached postmortems. I put together 3 slides and 20 pages of notes because that's who I am, entitled it Retrospectives That Change Tomorrow, Not Just Explain Yesterday. 8 people came then, 12, then a rotation of new hires who suspected I had copied the content from somewhere fancy because it seemed too organized for someone like me to have made. I told them the secret, which is not really a secret. Put the pain in a sentence. Decide what to do about it. Assign a name and a date. Repeat until boredom beats drama. The applause, if you can call it that, came later when we stopped repeating the same mistakes and started inventing new ones at a lower frequency. A promotion arrived like a polite escalation rather than a crown. My manager called me into a glass room that multiplied my reflection and asked if I wanted to lead a small new group. You see systems, she said, and you can talk to people. That combination is rarer than it should be. I told her I could try. I did not say I'm afraid I will break something important. She likely knew. Good managers often do. The role changed my calendar before it changed my identity. More one-on-ones, fewer hours of headphones and flow. Fewer tasks I could finish in a sitting, more problems that needed a week of careful neglect, punctuated by decisive sprints. I learned the hardest skill of that season: allocating other people's time. It's easier to give your own hours away than to direct someone else's with care. I made mistakes with the zeal of a beginner. I overstaffed a simple task and understaffed a tricky one. I allowed a meeting to continue for 90 minutes after it had surrendered its last useful sentence. I wrote feedback that was true but not kind and kind but not useful until I remembered that the goal is to be both. I wrote a one-page rubric for delivering feedback and taped it beside the monitor. Describe the behavior, explain the impact, offer a suggestion, ask for their view, agree on an experiment. The point was not to win. The point was to keep working together tomorrow. Underneath the meetings and the budgets, I kept a stack of index cards with rules I was trying to live by. Write the plan you wish you had found. If something hurts twice, automate it. Document so generously that your future self thanks you without recognizing you. Sleep is a skill. Practice it. If you can't explain it to an intern in 20 minutes, you don't understand it yet. Some rules grew into habits. Others I retired with a nod when they no longer fit the person I was becoming. Life outside the office got an upgrade so incremental that it looked like the weather. I moved from the storage locker room to a studio with a window that honored mornings. I traded fluorescent bulbs for warm lamps and thought perhaps too often about how light is a form of furniture. I bought a second-hand kettle that boiled with a cheerful click and an iron skillet that taught me patience. On the balcony, the studio had a sliver of one more ledge than landing. I grew basil convincingly and cherry tomatoes reluctantly. It was a productive failure. It reminded me that not everything needs to scale. I returned to my body in the least glamorous way. Push-ups that counted honesty over numbers. A kettlebell that looked judgmental in the corner until it became a partner. Deadlifts that repaired a back made tender by years of sitting like an apology. I stopped chasing any aesthetic story and aimed for durable instead. Sweat became a room where my past did not echo as loudly. Food became fuel more often than anesthetic. On good weeks, I slept like a person anchored to his own life. On bad weeks, I forgave myself like a coach rather than punishing myself like a parent. There were storms. A project buckled under a dependency we did not own, and I executed a textbook escalation that still felt like failure because the textbook doesn't have your name on it. A junior teammate submitted a pull request that was a cry for help written in code, and I missed it because I was busy performing leadership instead of practicing it. We fixed both problems, but I wrote 2 more index cards. Escalate early is not the same as surrender early. And if someone ships noise, check their calendar for silence. Chaos loves a vacuum. So does loneliness. My relationship with Maya mutated from heartbreak into a historical fact. I stopped telling versions of the story that made me the hero or the victim and learned to say when asked, "We wanted different things at the same time." It was both diplomatic and true. As for Leo, I discovered that refusal can be a form of peace. I refused to make him the measuring stick for my progress. I refused to curate my successes for an imagined audience in my childhood kitchen. I refused to rehearse the speech where I would finally balance the ledger of old humiliations. That fantasy, charming as it was on the bus at sunset, consumed energy I could spend on building something that would exist even if no one applauded. I started mentoring because someone made space for me to be the version of myself I needed 5 years earlier. The first time was awkward, like putting on a suit that didn't yet know your shape. I over-prepared. I had a syllabus and a reading list and a set of do this, not that diagrams. Then Sora the intern taught me in 10 minutes that people need a witness more than a script. She brought a problem that looked like code and revealed itself as confidence. I asked her to explain her choices. She did. They were good. "So what's the real question?" I asked. "Whether I'm allowed to trust myself," she said. We added a new rule to my index cards. When someone asks for permission, give them a plan. We wrote one together that day: what she would do, who she would tell when she would ask for help, and how she would measure done. She shipped. She smiled. We both learned. On Saturdays, I did a different kind of labor. I wrote the playbooks I wished I had found. From inbox to insight, how to stop drowning in requests. A 3-page proposal everyone can read. Red Team Fridays, how to kill our bad ideas before they kill our week. I kept them short enough that people ran out of excuses not to read them. This is how influence sneaks up on you. You write something small that solves a problem that embarrasses everyone equally. People begin to quote your sentences in rooms you are not in. Your name shows up in emails you did not draft. Meetings end sooner. The air changes, not dramatically but sufficiently. One evening, long after the last train of the day had announced itself to the tracks behind my building, I opened my banking app and frowned at a number large enough to look theoretical. I had crossed a line in my head that separated precarious from possible. It wasn't wealth, it was resiliency. The difference is not cosmetic. Wealth buys options. Resiliency buys dignity. I increased the monthly contribution to the boring funds by a small amount. I wrote another line in the notebook: when life gets better, don't forget to make the better automatic. It felt like tying a knot that would hold even if my hands were tired. Months layered into years with the narcotic steadiness of routine. The city wobbled through seasons. Construction reshaped the skyline into a set of question marks. Friends married, moved, slowed, or sped. I became a person people asked for advice, not because I was spectacular, but because I had suffered in the direction they were now walking. My answers got shorter. What do I do first? Write what hurts in a sentence. How do I get noticed? Reduce someone else's anxiety. How do I stop being afraid? You don't. You build despite it. The older I got, the less I believed in epiphanies. Most change is carpentry. You measure, you cut, you sand, and then one morning the chair holds your weight. I upgraded apartments one more time, this time to a high-floor one-bedroom with a balcony that earned the name. If I leaned on the rail, I could see the river blink in segments between buildings and the small procession of commuters whom the city treats like capillaries. On windy nights, the air sounded like weather from another country. I kept a blanket on the chair and a book on the side table and a pen to underline anything that felt like a tool rather than a decoration. I took a photo of the view and texted it to no one, not because I was lonely, but because sometimes privacy is a celebration too. On the practical side, I bought a car without drama. Reliable, perhaps even unfashionable. I chose it the way you choose a wrench, by what it can undo. The salesman tried to sell me the sport package. I said I wanted the competence package. He smiled, then laughed when he realized I was serious. I drove it home on a Sunday morning when the roads were empty and the sky looked ironed. I parked it in a spot that came with the lease and sat in it for a minute, after cutting the engine, listening to the tick-tick-tick of heat disappearing into quiet. I remembered bus rides spent pretending the city at dawn belonged to me, and thought I got here without applause. Good. There's a particular tenderness in being the only witness to your own milestones. My relationship to time changed in ways I could measure. I stopped chasing the speed of urgency and aligned to the pace of consequence. Not every message required a reply. Not every meeting required me. Not every crisis deserved my adrenaline. I instituted something I called Monday Maps for my team. We answered 3 questions in writing before noon. What will matter on Friday? What won't matter a month from now? What will we be glad to have started even if we don't finish? The ritual sounded like philosophy, but it functioned like armor. We made fewer promises. We kept more of them. Leadership, like weather, comes with fronts. A new executive brought a fondness for dashboards that made theater out of our labor. I learned to make the useful visible without turning it into performance art. Here is the signal. Here is the noise. Here is what we're doing about the noise. I didn't win every argument. I did win enough to protect the team from death by metric. We shipped better. I slept better. On the nights when sleep didn't come easy, I stepped onto the balcony and read the city's pulse in light. I thought about Leo without fury, like a character in a book I had closed and placed back on the shelf. I thought about Maya and the versions of us that might have been if we had met later, or if I had been less haunted by scarcity and she less persuaded by spectacle. But the balcony is not a time machine. It is a stage on which you practice acceptance. I learned to say I hope they're okay, and to mean it without volunteering to audition for their future. If there was a theme to those years, it was this: silence stopped being a hiding place and became a workshop. In silence, I learned which anxieties were alarms and which were habits. In silence, I learned that integrity is not an idea, but a series of small, unfancy choices, most of which no one sees. In silence, I built redundancies into my life so that the next time someone tried to yank a rug, they would discover I had installed floors. In an ordinary week, near the end of a long quarter, I returned to the notebook that still lived in the drawer by my desk and flipped past the early pages that smelled like perseverance. I added a new heading: principles I can explain to a stranger on a bus. I wrote 5. Earn your confidence by keeping small promises to yourself. Make your environment do the right thing by default. Automation is love letters to your future self. Choose reputational risk over ethical risk. I can survive being misunderstood. I cannot survive being someone I don't respect. When in doubt, be the person who reduces fear. Walk away from any room that only likes you when you're convenient. When I finished writing, I looked around the apartment like a person visiting a house he used to dream about. The kettle clicked. The basil looked smug. The book stood at attention. My reflection in the balcony door had changed in the slow, unphotogenic way that bodies change when minds recalibrate. I had shoulders now, not to impress, but to carry. People sometimes ask for the soundtrack of a life change, as if transformation comes with a playlist. If I had to pick a sound, it would not be strings or drums. It would be the soft, mechanical confidence of a well-tuned engine, the click of a deadbolt on a door you pay for, the pen tapping once on a notebook before writing something you intend to enact. It would be the murmur of a room where your team is working unsupervised because they don't need supervision as much as they need clarity. It would be the steady gulp of an espresso machine at 5:45 a.m. It would be the lack of sirens. By the time the outside world began to notice me, whatever that means, probably the car, probably the view, probably the way my voice stopped auditioning for approval, I had already noticed myself. That is the order I would wish on anyone. Recognition is a dessert. Self-respect is breakfast. If I sound pious, forgive me. I am only trying to report accurately on the difference between then and now. Then I stood in rooms drafting a defense. Now I stand at the balcony rail and draft a plan. And because life is not a straight narrative but a braid, there were threads I didn't pull. There were messages from numbers I didn't recognize that identified themselves later. There were invitations to weddings and reunions I placed on the counter and moved around like coasters, trying to decide whether to RSVP yes to closure or no to chaos. There were evenings when memory tried to auction off the past at prices I could no longer afford. I paid with attention or didn't, depending on whether the story served the person I was building. If you had asked me at 21 what success would feel like, I would have said revenge with too much enthusiasm. If you ask me now, I will say capacity. The capacity to say no without apology. The capacity to say yes without fear. The capacity to carry two things at once, ambition and gentleness. The capacity to build a life that remains intact whether or not the people who once misjudged you ever correct their math. One night near the end of that chapter, I left the office late, but not defeated, and drove with the windows down through a corridor of trees the city had forgotten to cut. The radio played a song I didn't know, and I didn't change it because not knowing is sometimes the point. I rode the elevator with a neighbor and her dog who looked like a mistake that became family, and unlocked my door. The apartment smelled like clean and cumin from a dinner I had taught myself to cook without checking a recipe on my phone. I put my keys in the bowl by the door and stood still long enough to feel the room notice me. The quiet did not accuse. It welcomed. I went to the balcony with a glass of water and watched the river become a ribbon of broken lights. Somewhere out there were stories that had once swallowed mine whole. Somewhere out there Leo might have been telling one of them. Somewhere else Maya might have been reconsidering how she had weighed presence and promise. I did not summon a speech. I did not stage a scene. I said aloud to no one in particular, "I'm okay," and realized that sentence, more than any spreadsheet, more than any title on a business card, was the thing I had been working toward. I turned the chair toward the door as if to signal that tomorrow had permission to arrive, and set an alarm for a time that would look unkind to anyone who didn't understand what I was trying to build. The notebook waited in the drawer, the pen beside it. When the alarm rang in the morning, I would write a date at the top of a new page and move another quiet inch in a direction most people can't see. I have learned to trust those inches. They are how bridges happen. They are how you cross. I didn't plan an entrance. I planned my breathing. The morning of the reunion, I set my keys on the counter and stared at them, the way you look at a compass before a long walk. The black fob was heavier than it needed to be an object designed to announce itself. I hadn't bought the car to impress anyone. I had bought it because my time had become more expensive than my pride. Still, I knew what it would communicate before I said a word. Symbols save you speeches. The community hall sat behind the park where we used to play tag as kids. Whoever decorated it had a fondness for rented plants and optimism. You could smell sugar from the sheet cake and the ancient chill of air conditioning that only knew two settings on and louder. I pulled into the lot and let the engine settle into silence. Heads turned before I even opened the door. A cousin I hadn't seen since braces nudged another cousin I couldn't name. It was the choreography of recognition without welcome. I stepped out in a suit that fit like a decision. Not flashy charcoal clean lines, nothing that shouted, but it didn't apologize for itself either. I locked the car and walked toward the entrance with my hands empty. Taking nothing with you is a way of saying you are not here to cling. Inside, the sound was a mix of fork against plate and laughter that wanted to be louder than it was. Paper banners declared family in letters so big they looked like a dare. I paused long enough to let the room notice me. It's a strange thing, being a roomer in a place you used to belong to. People sense the change before their faces admit it. Conversations fray at the edges and knit themselves back together with different patterns. My mother saw me first. Her expression flickered like a light bulb in a stairwell, bright then brittle. She stepped forward with a smile that had angles. "Evan," she said, as if tasting the name for the first time in years, "so you decided to come. You didn't RSVP." "It's a family reunion," I said, letting my voice be ordinary. I assumed entry was implied. There was a small ring of silence around us, the kind you get when waiters are carrying a cake, and people pretend not to notice until it appears. My mother's eyes traveled from my face to my shoes to the doors I'd walked through. She inhaled the way people do when they are about to choose between cruelty and civility. "Well," she said, "you always liked doing things your own way." Eventually, I said. It took me a while to learn how. If the room had an axis, it shifted when Leo arrived in the conversation. He approached with the posture of a man who had practiced this moment in a mirror. The suit was good. The watch was cheaper than it wanted to be. Beside him, Maya carried a small purse and the old precise smile of someone who never wasted a gesture. Seeing them together felt like looking into a snow globe, beautiful from the outside, suffocating if you were inside it. "Look who finally crawled out of productivity jail," Leo said loud enough for the nearest tables to hear. He glanced toward the parking lot. "Nice ride. Lease terms must be brutal." "It's mine," I said. "No payments." The words were not a punch, they were a door closing. The air shifted a few degrees cooler. A few relatives practiced their neutral faces. Leo's grin thinned, then reset itself as if he had multiple versions on file. "Good for you," he said. "Still doing that, what do you call it, desk thing?" "It's changed," I said. "I run a group now, and a few investments on the side." I didn't fill the silence with numbers. You don't owe your ledger to people who earned your contempt. The point wasn't the size, the point was the independence. Maya's eyes traveled the same path my mother's had, but gentler, calculating without malice. "You look different," she said as if diagnosing a patient. "Stronger." "Work will do that," I said. "So will sleep and decent food." A cousin drifted by with plastic cups and curiosity. An aunt offered a slice of cake in the kind of compliment people give when they want to step closer without taking sides. I took the plate and the compliment. Small bridges are still bridges. The hall hummed with the theater of families pretending time only mends. There was a slideshow looping on a white wall, childhood photos blown up past their dignity. I saw a younger version of Leo holding a trophy, a younger version of me holding a library certificate, and I wondered not for the first time why applause had felt like a birthright for one boy and a door prize for the other. I felt the old ache tug at the hem of the present and let it fall back. Today wasn't about persuading the past to apologize. Today was about refusing to apologize to the past. Leo leaned in the way men do when they want to turn a conversation into a stage. "You know," he said, "everyone's curious. You disappeared. Some of us thought you couldn't handle the pressure." "I removed myself from a worse pressure," I said. "The kind where you pay rent in self-respect." My mother laughed a shade too brightly. "Evan has always had a way with words," she told the table. She meant it as a pin. I let it be a button and fastened my composure. A distant relative raised a glass and called for a toast to the whole family. The phrase hovered like a moth. People drank. Some of the eyes that landed on me looked warmer now, as if acknowledging a weather front moving in. This is how power announces itself in polite rooms, not with fanfare, but with the soft movement of chairs. I moved through the hall, talking in short paragraphs. A cousin asked where I lived. I described the neighborhood rather than the view. An uncle wanted to know what running a group meant. I told him it meant fewer heroics and better systems. A niece with frosting on her chin asked if my car went fast. "Faster than your bicycle," I said, "but not as fun." The room was not kind, but it had stopped being hostile. That distinction matters. It's the difference between swimming and fighting for air. I could feel Leo noticing the change and hating it. The spotlight he liked had misremembered its mark. He tried again. "So what's the plan, Evan? You going to start showing up more? Maybe we can finally count on you for something." "Count on me, to be honest," I said. "I won't be the family wallet. I won't be the family punching bag. If you want help with a problem, bring an honest one." A few chairs made the small sound of people sitting straighter. Honesty is often mistaken for insult by people who have not used it in years. Maya had been quiet, orbiting the conversation with the smooth avoidance of an experienced diplomat. Now she stepped closer and touched my arm just below the elbow, the way she used to when we were partners walking into rooms that weren't yet ours. Her voice was pitched for me but audible to anyone who wanted to borrow it. "Maybe we could catch up later," she said. "Just the two of us. Talk." I let the touch remain for a second longer than politeness required so that everyone could understand the geometry. Then I looked at her hand and then at her face. "Of course we can talk," I said. "I prefer the truth." She withdrew her hand like a person facing a stove whose heat she had underestimated. "I meant, we have history." "We do," I said. "It taught me how to break a loop." The room pulled in the way rooms do when they sense a story approaching its decision. A wine glass paused midair. The slideshow in the corner shifted to a picture of a picnic where we were all younger and apparently more edible to mosquitoes. Maya's eyes held mine with something that wasn't apology so much as curiosity about the man who had learned to stop asking for permission. "Evan," she said almost gently, "we were young." "We were," I said. "That's not a crime. But there's a difference between being young and being cruel." Leo cut in. "Oh, come on, you're not still nursing that old thing. People move on." "I did," I said. "That's why we're having different conversations." I could have been dramatic. There is nobility to restraint. I didn't list the nights I rode buses and plotted my exit from invisibility. I didn't catalog the small humiliations that had taught me to carry myself like a boarder. I didn't narrate the way money becomes quiet when you make it earn its keep. I kept the speech I had written for a different life in my pocket and let the present do its own work. A distant cousin, tipsy, kind, reckless in the way that happens after 3 toasts, asked loudly, "Evan, do you have someone special now?" The question fell with the softness of a thrown pillow. People laughed to cover the way they leaned in. Maya's expression shifted, and for a moment I saw the version of her that had admired my ambition before it threatened her comfort. "I just wondered," she said, and her voice held a tremor that might have been sincerity whether we ended things too quickly. There it was, the invitation inside the performance. The old calculus had changed. The numbers were new. For a second I let myself remember the early days, the certainty of being seen, the feeling of a plan drawn by two hands. Then I remembered the rest. "I don't rewind," I said quietly enough to be kind and clearly enough to be heard. "When I was climbing with empty pockets, I wasn't enough. I won't be a person you circle back to because the view changed. I'd rather be alone than be with someone who only shows up for the arrival." The room went still. Silence is not always emptiness. Sometimes it is agreement that doesn't trust itself to clap. Maya's jaw worked, as if trying to find words that would stay true after they left her mouth. None came. She nodded once, a small professional gesture, and stepped back. There was no dramatics, no thrown drinks. She simply surrendered the story she'd hoped to reclaim. Leo's face did what faces do when the script changes without warning. His smirk collapsed into something sharper. "You think you're better than me now? You think a car and a title make you the man?" I didn't raise my voice, no, and that's the point. Money is loud and short, character is quiet and long. I built for long. A murmur moved through the hall like wind through a wheat field. An uncle made a sound that might have been approval. A grandmotherly cousin patted my arm as if I were a child who had finally learned to eat with a fork. My mother attempted a laugh that didn't catch. She started to say, "Well, hasn't Evan grown up?" and then let the sentence die of natural causes when no one rescued it. People began to ask me questions that were not tests. "What do you like about your work? What do you do when you're not working? Do you see the city changing?" Easy questions, the kind you ask when you want to put someone at eye level. I answered them plainly without the reflex to audition. Being believed is a habit. You start by practicing on yourself. I didn't stay long after that. Part of leadership is knowing when a meeting has reached its most useful minute. I thanked the aunt who had saved me a slice of the corner piece of cake. I hugged a cousin who had recently had a baby and pretended to know how to support a newborn's head. I told my niece to keep the frosting and the curiosity. I nodded to my mother. I shook Leo's hand because I refused to be a person who teaches himself meanness. He squeezed too hard. I didn't. Outside the air was cooler, a rehearsal for evening. The car recognized the fob and unlocked itself with a small, almost embarrassed sound. I looked back through the glass doors and saw movement, small knots of family reconfiguring their narratives, deciding which version of this story they would carry home. That's their work, not mine. When I closed the door of the car, the quiet felt earned. I didn't turn on the radio. I drove with the windows down through streets that had watched me move from anonymous to unafraid. The lot emptied from the rear view. The hall shrank to a rectangle of light, then nothing. I didn't feel triumphant. Triumphant is for competitions. What I felt was alignment. The person who had walked in hoping to survive their opinions had walked out indifferent to them. That is a kind of wealth no statement captures. At a red light, I caught my reflection in the side window, same face, different posture. I said out loud, "Because rituals matter, I am not a petition." Then I laughed at how dramatic that sounded and corrected it. "I don't need them. Better, truer, enough." Back at my place, the lock clicked in a way that still made me grateful. I set the keys down, poured a glass of water, and stood on the balcony while the city's lights negotiated with the dark. Somewhere inside that hall, plates were being cleared and conclusions were being drawn. Somewhere stories were being edited with new adjectives. I didn't rehearse my rebuttals. I let the night have the last word. There will be other reunions. Families are a renewable resource for events. There will be new scripts and old temptations. But I'll arrive at those rooms the way I arrived at this one, holding my center, not my case. If they ask for help honestly, I'll listen. If they ask for performance, I'll pass. I have built a life sturdy enough to hold both compassion and distance. That is the inheritance I chose when the one on offer could not be trusted. Before bed, I opened the same notebook I had written in years earlier and added a line under the sentence about freedom. Respect yourself in public by practicing it in private. Today had been proof of rehearsal. I closed the book. The day closed with it. I slept without auditioning for anyone's approval. Silence followed my answer the way a tide follows the moon. I hadn't raised my voice. I had only refused to rewind the tape. "I don't revisit what I had to survive," I said to Maya, steady enough for the room to borrow my balance. When I was climbing with nothing, I wasn't enough. I won't be someone you circle back to because the lighting changed. I'd rather stand alone than stand for that. Glasses paused, then settled. Leo's smile collapsed into a line that looked like a verdict he wanted to deliver. "So now you're the authority on worth," he said, aiming for a laugh and hitting the wall behind it. "No," I answered and kept my hands at my sides. "I'm the authority on my boundaries. Money is loud for a moment. Character is quiet for a long time." A murmur moved through the nearest tables, recognition without applause. My mother tried to catch the moment with a brittle little laugh that used to control the weather in our house. It landed and didn't bounce. Maya nodded once as if accepting a diagnosis. She didn't argue, and I didn't catalog the history she'd hoped would do the arguing for her. That restraint felt like closing a loop I'd been running since 21. Leo stepped closer, hand out, as if to shake grip, ready to prove. I met it without theater. There is a difference between refusing someone and teaching yourself meanness. I refused the second. After that, the room did what rooms do when a new story is voted into existence. Questions softened. An aunt asked about my work without turning it into a test. A cousin wanted to know what I actually enjoy on the days I'm not building anything. I answered plainly. Being believed is a muscle. You train it first on yourself. I didn't stay to let the narrative harden around me. I thanked the people who had made space, said goodnight to the ones still deciding, and walked out with the same measured breathing I'd walked in with. The night air felt like permission. In the glass door, I caught a last reflection of the hall, small clusters, reforming adjectives being reassigned. Driving home, I felt neither triumphant nor wounded. I felt aligned. I had not won a contest. I had stopped auditioning. At my door, the lock clicked like a promise I'd learned to keep. I wrote one line in the old notebook, I don't need them. They needed me to stay small. Then I slept through the night, an accomplishment I had once mistaken for a luxury.